Hey everybody, it's Greg. I'm here working on Bogey Bob, overhauling the engine on my 1981 G1 golf cart. So we started off today by taking off the oil container and draining that. And one of the reasons is I needed the oil. Plus I wanted to clean it out. But let's show you the project at hand, which involves putting the crankcase back together. So the service manual says that well, I need to lube up that bearing, I need to lube up that crank bearing, I need to lube up that bearing, and so they say use two-stroke oil. So then we're getting ready to put the crankcase halves back together, and it says I'm supposed to start with the left side or the clutch side. Before us, I've spent the day kind of doing a lot of MacGyvering. So when I drained the oil pan, so rather than just squirting oil in here, I actually immersed the whole crank itself so that this bearing was entirely, well, the whole crank assembly and connecting rod was soaking in oil. So this sucker moves pretty freely now. So to reassemble this, we're going to use a Torx crankshaft puller. So basically this will connect to the end of the crankshaft. It'll slide through this tube and basically, once we put that nut on, it'll eventually draw that crank through the bearing, through the seal into its seated position. Well, it all sounds easy, but if you look at it, at least the one that I've got, is the diameter of this face on the spacer, puller, or call it what you will, is smaller than the diameter of the crankcase itself. So in essence, what I'd be doing is pulling, all of the pull force would be on this seal. So I needed to figure out some way to create a spacer just like the old tool in the service manual shows, and I came up with this. It kind of almost looks like a spring compressor, but literally it was two half shells of steel that I had in scrap. Did a little more bending, a couple of hose clamps, and now it fits just clearing the diameter of that seal. So now all the pressure that I'm going to be pushing on this to pull that bearing in is pushing against this, the crankcase, rather than the black seal itself. Basically, as you can see, you got to kind of MacGyver a lot of stuff together if you just don't have the absolute correct tool. Okay, I think I finally have the assembly process figured out with the crankshaft puller, the bolt. So insert the crankshaft in. Don't forget to add grease to the seal. We got a 1/2 inch fine thread bolt inserted through the puller adapter. We're going to screw that all the way in quite a ways. This is where it's going to get a little clumsy and take a couple hands probably. So now we are going to thread that adapter or collar into the end of the puller. And it just has to be finger tight. And then we're going to take our MacGyvered spacer, and if you remember, the inside diameter of this is just a touch bigger than the outside diameter of the seal. So we want it to be pressing on against the crankcase, pressing or pulling against the crankcase. Now I also need something as kind of a filler because this puller is going to slip right through here. So I've got a 1937 era tool, clutch puller or something. So I'm going to insert that In fact, let me check something out. Yep, I gotta put it that way. So we're gonna insert that next. And then trying to keep a little pressure on the puller to keep the crank from falling that way. Now we'll insert the puller, and this little pin has to line up with a groove, as well as getting the other end lined up through the hole. Okay, so now pretty much all things are assembled. Put on the nut. You can see this is kind of awkward with just one person, and also in a horizontal position. If I had right now I've got the crank half clamped into the vise using the two bolts that will mount it to the basically the frame on the cart. So there, I think we've got everything fairly snugged up. I'm kind of rotating this MacGyver collar around to make sure that I'm not sitting on the seal itself. Well, so far things are going relatively well. So let's keep going. So let's take a closer look down there. And you can see the progress we're making. So we're probably, a good halfway through the pull. So it slipped out of the vise. Number one, I didn't have it tight enough, and also we are now putting a lot of pressure basically trying to turn the entire crankcase with this puller, and you can hear basically the bearing kind of like verbally resisting. I don't want to go in, I don't want to go in. So just to give myself another hand, I decided to zip tie the connecting rod into a vertical position. So now the crankshaft is wanting to turn on me a little bit, so I put the flywheel back on, and so I can reposition the crank, or possibly use this as kind of a holding device as I tighten down the puller. We're getting close, because now all the pressure, I'm having trouble putting enough pressure on that wrench, as well as holding the flywheel to keep the crankshaft from turning. So right now, if I don't hold the flywheel, I'm just turning the crankshaft. So let's back that up a little bit. And now I'm going to kind of use my body a little bit and my hand. Yeah, there's still something to go. I think we're firmly seated, and back. Let's cut that off, and we'll see if this thing spins freely. Okay, so I took that zip tie off, and basically, I feel a little resistance, but I assume that's because I still have tension on this puller. But in checking measurements between the web and the crankcase, I've only got 16 thousandths of an inch. So that's actually a tighter clearance than the gap between the thrust washer and the connecting rod. So I think I'm done. We'll go ahead and remove that puller, and hopefully this thing spins freely.